Well, the issue of insularity, I think, is a really good jumping off point because I think the discourse that many people who identify as leftists attach themselves to actually is counterproductive in building solidarity, and thus, buttresses a certain kind of insularity. I mean, when I think about this question that Andrew posed, I think about, I don't know, again, the kind of terminology that people attach themselves to, the concepts that people who are leftists attach themselves to. And I think if we want to have, in keeping with Harvey's point that any, real left politics requires some focus, maybe a central focus on labor, I would be a happy man if I could go the rest of my life without ever hearing the phrase slavery is our original sin or racism is our original sin. And that's assuming I live another 40 years. All right. I don't want to die 5 minutes from now and never hear that phrase again. That would not make me happy. But if I live another 40 years, if I were to live another 40 years without hearing that phrase, again, I would be a happy man. I would, be pretty happy to not hear white privilege again. I would be pretty happy if structural racism were retired as well. And there's a longer list than that, but I'll just center on those three. And what bothers me about those three and the ubiquity of them is I think, everyone who uses those frameworks has the best of intentions. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I think everyone who uses those three frameworks and others I would like to retire imagines themselves being committed to living in a better world. But the problem with each of them is that they're counter-solidaristic. And in at least one case, I don't know, they're kind of racist. And the one that I'm thinking that's kind of racist, but I'd make the case that it might not be just one of those three, would be slavery is the original sin, right? Or racism is our original sin. And one of the reasons that one bothers me so much is that I went to Catholic school for 8 years, and while it made me agnostic like it was supposed to, I mean, I think that's what my dad would attest to, so mission accomplished there.
Thank you very
much.
I
don't remember a lot about my religious training in Catholic school because I wasn't really that interested, to be honest. But I know what original sin is, right? And original sin you're stuck with forever. And of course, then that framework, say racism is our original sin. Well, I mean, that's actually racist insofar as it rejects the idea by its very nature that race is a social construct and racism is, an expression of one's attachments to ideologies and the ideology of race, right? And instead treats racism and race as if they're ontological forces that can never really be exercised. And I think that does all of us a disservice, but frankly, as a Black person, I think it does Black people a disservice. There's no way to win from that one. And of course, it's, I think, a cousin of ideological frameworks that conservatives embrace. Even as I know the people who attach themselves to racism is the nation's original sin or whatever, understand themselves to not be conservative, I think that it is a profoundly conservative framework because it imputes qualities to race that a social construct can't have. It treats it as natural. White privilege, I think, kind of ends up, falling into much the same trap. It equates whiteness with privilege, and by extension, Blackness with disadvantage. And of course, one of the things that does is it encourages people to imagine, well-meaning people, that all Black people have the same interests, that Black people are necessarily progressive, let's say, because we're all disadvantaged. And what I like to fall back on is that some of you might know the date, it's 2013 or 2014. There was a major controversy where Oprah was in Switzerland or someplace, was trying to buy a $38,000 handbag at some point in Obama's second term. And it was one of those fancy stores that that the clerk has to size you up before they buzz you in, and the clerk sized up Oprah, didn't recognize Oprah, just saw a black woman, didn't let Oprah in the store, and this was an outrageous expression of racism. And it was certainly an expression of racism. But at the time, one of the things that I was really dismayed by with this exchange, because this became evidence that racism is still with us, like I didn't know that, was that the average median income or the median household income for a black family of four at the time, I think was just a few $1,000s more than Oprah's handbag. I think it was like, $41,000, $42,000 a year compared with Oprah's $38,000 handbag. And to be honest, the first thought that I had when I saw this was not what an outrage it was that Oprah couldn't buy this handbag because this person was racist. I mean, that sucks. But I'm familiar with how Oprah made her money in the 80s and 90s. And she did sell herself in that period as the black person that white people could confide in, right? The black person wasn't really the black person. Wrong, apparently, since she couldn't get that handbag. But I already knew that. Right? I knew that was coming. But I thought to myself that what's outrageous is that somebody has so much money that they can spend $38,000 on a handbag. That's the first thing that I thought was outrageous. And the second thing I thought was outrageous is that I'm supposed to give a damn, right? That Oprah couldn't buy a $38,000 handbag. I didn't care. I just didn't care. The last thing, on my short list, but this is my abridged list, of course, structural racism. Again, I know this is another one that people who attach themselves to, make clear that they want to live in a more just society. But the funny thing about it is, just like racism is the nation's original sin, I think structural racism has the tendency to uncouple racial inequality from the political economic forces that generate it. I know people are going to hear this as class reductionist, but I want to remind them, if you do, I just said that in my reflections on Oprah, I never bought for a minute that Oprah wealthed her way out of blackness, right? I also alluded to the fact that in the 80s and 90s, when I was a teen and in my early 20s, when Oprah was a different kind of talk show host, I found Oprah's persona as the black person who made white people feel comfortable, who wasn't really black, noxious and offensive. And I still find it offensive. And I found that offensive about Obama's post-racialism too. So I'm not someone who denies the existence of racism. Racism is real. And I've had my own personal experiences with it, as well as witnessing people's experiences with it. But to acknowledge that racism isn't real, or to acknowledge that racism is real, right? Even if race isn't, to acknowledge that racism is real is not to uncouple it from the world of human contrivance. And I think structural racism as a construct tends to do that. And just to amplify this point, people have been talking about structural racism for a long time. I mean, the phrase itself is, I think, probably new, or at least new to most. But the Moynihan Report, for what it's worth, and the Johnson administration's approach to the war on poverty presumed that something that we would call structural racism was responsible for a major contributor to the racial disparities of the 1960s, right? So, that's just not new, even if the phrase is new, even if the concept is new to people who didn't take history courses in college. But, that's not my fault if you didn't take history courses in college. A lot of the stuff that's recently been discovered, like redlining, let's say, which people seem to imagine that historians have ignored, until 2014, I learned about when I was in college, in the 80s, in the late 80s, early 90s, right? Frankly, I learned about it in high school, but my dad's a professor, so that doesn't count. But I absolutely learned about that stuff in history classes and political science and sociology classes as an undergraduate between the late 80s and early 90s. But again, just because it's new to you doesn't mean that it's new. And the problem is that with this particular notion of inequality, which one more time uncouples race from place and time, but also racial inequality, more specifically from the material world that we occupy, is that it just hasn't lent itself to solutions. And in fact, I think if one were to reflect on, let's say, put them all together, structural racism, white privilege, and slavery, racism as our nation's original sin, and just reflect on the summer that was our great awakening and how little material change took place then or now, right? But how much symbolic change took place. Then you can get a sense of what irks me about these frameworks, because they're frameworks that lend themselves to bringing down monuments, which should, people who committed high treason in defense of the undemocratic institution of slavery should never have had monuments to them. But it lends itself to bringing down monuments. It lends itself to taking Aunt Jemima off the box, right? It lends themselves to rich people donating, billions of dollars to social justice as rich people define it. I think that's called charity, though. It doesn't lend itself to the kind of, and it lends itself to a discourse that creates more openings for Black and brown CEOs and entrepreneurs. But what it doesn't do is lend itself to uplifting those people who are at the bottom, right? It doesn't lend itself, this discourse does not lend itself to doing right by the people that Michael Brooks was interested in, just to bring this full circle, but doing right by working class people, poor people, and even more and more people who identify as middle class are obviously struggling. And that's who I think leftists, to bring us back to Harvey's point about the centrality of labor, that's what leftists need to be concerned about.